Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of Cause for Concern, Notwithstanding Canada's Charter, a podcast mini-series produced by the Centre for Constitutional Studies at the University of Alberta. This series draws on the expertise of legal scholars, litigators, and community members to demystify a hot topic in recent constitutional debates, the Notwithstanding Clause. This clause has been largely understood as a tool that allows Canadian legislatures to prevent their laws from being struck down by the courts on certain charter grounds for renewable 5-year periods. Sounds straightforward enough, right? Well, actually no. There's a lot of nuance and debate over how exactly this clause should function and whether there are or should be limits on its use. To illuminate these debates, this podcast looks into the history and reasoning behind the inclusion of the clause in the Charter. We attempt to answer what has happened when it has been invoked in the past, what the advantages and pitfalls are of governments using the clause, and how its use has been experienced by people who have been impacted by it. Essentially, this podcast aims to make sense of this opaque constitutional provision and hopefully answer the question, what should we do about the Notwithstanding Clause moving forward? To kickstart the series, we sit down with University of Alberta constitutional law professor Eric Adams, who provides an overview of this controversial provision. We ask why this seemingly contradictory section ended up in the Charter and how early advocates imagined it would function before examining the first point in Section 33's evolution, its omnibus invocation by Quebec, and the Supreme Court's analysis of that invocation in the 1988 case of Ford and Quebec. We also explore how effective the so-called Sunset Clause really is as a limit on Section 33, how Section 33 can potentially serve to protect rather than limit rights, and how the recent spike in its use overlaps with the rise of populism in Canada and beyond. Keep listening to find out whether Section 33 is a clause for concern, and if so, what Canadians can do about it. Hello, Professor Adams. Welcome to the first episode of the podcast.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
In this episode, we want to demystify the Notwithstanding Clause. To start, could you briefly explain what the Notwithstanding Clause is and how it relates to other parts of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
Well, I notice you've used the word briefly in that question. It's complex, the Notwithstanding Clause, because it isn't like other provisions of the Charter. And so it catches a lot of people off guard. What's this thing doing here? And every time I teach my course on the Canadian Constitution, you start with Section 1 of the Charter often, and what Section 1 says is that it guarantees rights and freedoms. And lo and behold, 32 sections later, you end up at Section 33, which seems to suggest in other ways Charter rights are not guaranteed, at least not guaranteed in the way that many of us assume when we read the Charter itself. So what is Section 33? Effectively, it is a continuation in limited form, I would say, a continuation in limited form of an older view of constitutionalism that existed in Canada for a very long time before the Charter, which was premised on the notion of parliamentary supremacy, the idea that, in simple terms, the Parliament or a provincial legislature can make or unmake any law that they want. They have the full scope, authority, power, and responsibility to make laws. And if you don't like that laws, and if those laws are bad, if those laws interfere or infringe with someone's rights, parliamentary supremacy says, well, then change your government and get a new government to change that law. So that's the fundamental premise of parliamentary supremacy. And it's a very democratic idea, which is that we elect people to make our laws. They are accountable to us, and the laws that they make should have full freedom to make whatever law that they wish. So along comes the charter and says, actually, Parliament and legislatures, there are things that you can't make laws about. You can't make any law that you wish. You can't, for example, make a law that unreasonably interferes with someone's freedom of religion. You can't declare that Canada is a Protestant state and that we all need to be Protestants. And if we're going to shut down Catholic churches and Jewish synagogues and take away people's religious freedoms. Well, no, Section 2A of the Charter is going to say that law is of no force or effect because it interferes with your freedom of religion. And I think in 1982, many Canadians were glad for this constitutional change. Not everyone, but most people thought that Canada had a history in which rights had not been fully protected with our system of parliamentary supremacy, and that taking some rights and entrenching them in the Constitution and limiting the capacity of Parliament and legislatures to take away those rights was a good thing. Okay, so now back to the Notwithstanding Clause. The Notwithstanding Clause emerged out of the negotiations in the Charter, I'm sure we'll talk about it, in which a number of provincial premiers said, we at least want a way to continue some elements of that tradition of parliamentary supremacy, even with a charter. And the Notwithstanding Clause becomes a bit of a compromise where not on every charter right, but on a select number of charter rights, sections 2, the fundamental freedoms, freedom of religion would be on the list, and sections 7 to 15 of the charter. If a law interferes with one of those protected rights outlined in the charter, then there is the option for Parliament or the legislatures to use the Notwithstanding Clause to effectively shield that law, to put a protective casing around it and that says, well, it doesn't matter if this law is going to interfere with this provision of the Charter. A court is not going to be able to declare that law of no force or effect. So effectively, the law will continue, notwithstanding, there's that powerful word, notwithstanding the fact that it is contrary to a charter right. Now, I earlier said that it was a limited continuation of that idea of parliamentary supremacy. And there are some limits, and I've mentioned one of them already. It's not all of the charter rights. It's only a select number of charter rights that it can be used against. And 2, it's time limited. So it's not forever. You don't press a button and boom, this law is always protected, or those charter rights fall away for every piece of legislation. When you invoke the Notwithstanding Clause, it only works in the law that you place that clause in. And 2, it only operates for a maximum of 5 years. And so lawyers would say that there's a sunset provision. It's always going to end. And at the end of that 5 years, if the Parliament or legislature doesn't do anything else, then the Notwithstanding Clause provision ends, and effectively that means now that law is subject to all of the charter rights and freedoms of the full charter. Of course, there's a wrinkle. You can renew your use of the Notwithstanding Clause. So if every 5 years a Parliament or a legislature wants to keep that Notwithstanding Clause active and providing that protective shield around that law, they simply need to reenact that Notwithstanding Clause. So maybe that's enough of a intro.
That was great. One of the major issues surrounding constitutional interpretation is who gets the power to decide when a right can be legitimately limited. How does the Notwithstanding Clause resolve this question? And how does it allocate power between courts, lawmakers, and the electorate?
The first part of that question is really about the interplay in some ways of Section 1 and charter rights. So let me say a little bit about that. Governments, when they make laws, have to comply with the Constitution, which says that we'll protect guarantee people's charter rights to freedom of religion, freedom of expression, equality, life, liberty, and security of the person. But Section 1 of the Charter says that governments can reasonably, well, how to phrase this, that a law can potentially interfere with a charter right as long as it does so in a reasonable way that's demonstrably justifiable, that there are good reasons for doing so, and that the limits imposed are proportionate. What's an example of that? Well, for example, even though we have a right to free speech, the law says that you can't defame people. You can't go around saying that your neighbor, committed a murder and just got out of prison for that. If that's not true, if you say those things, even though you have a free speech right, you can be held liable under the law for saying a lie about someone that damages their reputation. That's the law of defamation. Is that a reasonable limit on your right to freedom of expression? Well, Section 1 would say, well, what's the reason for that interference with free speech rights, and are we doing so in a proportionate way? And if someone constitutionally challenged the defamation laws, which they have, a court is going to find that, well, those are reasonable limits under Section 1. So even though that law interferes with somebody's freedom of expression, it's still a constitutional law. It's still valid under the Charter. Sometimes governments have chafed a bit or not agreed with what the court says is a reasonable limit. So the government might say, well, we think this is a reasonable limit. Denying people who commit a certain crime, denying them the right to bail. Well, we think that's a reasonable limit on your legal rights under the Charter. And the court might come along and say, well, actually, no, that's not a reasonable limit. You can't just blanket deny people bail without hearing the circumstances. We have an individual right to bail. You can't do that in that way. That's not a reasonable limit. So what Section 33 says is, well, maybe the parliament or legislature can effectively say, well, we just disagree with where the court is drawing its reasonable limits. We want to say that we think we have a reasonable limit, even if the court disagrees. We think the court is wrong. And Section 33 gives the option of having the parliament say, well, we're going to enact that law anyway, even after a court says that we've drawn the line in the wrong place, and we're going to use the notwithstanding clause to make that law operate, notwithstanding the fact that some court thinks that we've got the line drawing wrong. And lots of the early proponents of the notwithstanding clause really had that view of it in mind. And in particular, they said, we need a mechanism for when courts, or if courts, happen to get some big constitutional issue and case disastrously wrong. If a court draws the line in the wrong place about what a reasonable limit is, we want the capacity or Section 33 will give the capacity of parliaments and legislatures to reply effectively to that court and say, you think our line drawing is wrong? Well, we think your line drawing is wrong under the Constitution. And so we're going to use the notwithstanding clause to make that law a law. But here's the other thing. The notwithstanding clause doesn't require the government to wait for a legal decision. That's not in the text of the notwithstanding clause. And the very first use of the notwithstanding clause by Quebec in 1982 certainly didn't wait for any judicial decision. So it doesn't need to be responsive in that sense. So what has happened in the handful of times that the notwithstanding clause has been used, oftentimes it's used by a government preemptively to say, well, we didn't wait for a court to tell us that they didn't like our law and they didn't like where we drew our line of a reasonable limit. We're just getting out of that debate entirely. We are going to say that we're adding the notwithstanding clause before a court even weighs in on whether or not we've got a reasonable limit or not. let's just add the notwithstanding clause right out of the gates and bypass effectively the court's view of the reasonable limit. And the notwithstanding clause has been used, and I think some would say in a concerning way, increasingly so, by governments in that kind of preemptive fashion. There was a second part of that question. I think I only answered the first part.
The second part asks more specifically with how the notwithstanding clause allocates power between courts, lawmakers, and the electorate.
I think our Constitution really has those three institutions in mind: courts, the electorate, and governments, parliament and legislatures, in its constitutional vision of power sharing. And that's a really, I think, powerful democratic ideal, and it's one worth preserving. And I think it happens to also provide the best government. When only one of those institutions has too much power or dominates the others, then I think your constitutional system is less healthy. And the notwithstanding clause, in some ways, it appears to grant an awful lot of power to the parliament or legislatures. You can add that shield to your law. You don't have to listen to what the court says about whether or not it's unconstitutional. And some people, I think, are rightly concerned with the notwithstanding clause for those reasons. But I think a couple of things temper that. And the first is the sunset clause. So the fact that the notwithstanding clause has to be always and perpetually debated and added into the electoral cycle of any government, it effectively necessitates the public having a say, and potentially a very powerful say, in whether or not the use of the notwithstanding clause is appropriate. So anytime a government invokes the notwithstanding clause, they're exposing themselves to the public criticism that that's not what we want this government to do. When the next election comes, we're going to vote for the other party that says we won't do that, or we're going to cancel the notwithstanding clause. And for a long time, it was thought that this idea of what's sometimes called a political cost would be really high. So that would be its own check on governments abusing or misusing or overusing the notwithstanding clause. What I think is maybe unfolding in our present moment is that people are pointing out, well, maybe the political costs aren't that high, or they aren't high enough. And maybe sometimes the use of the notwithstanding clause, in fact, might be popular, in which case there's no political cost at all. There might be a political benefit. And this might be especially the case if a particularly vulnerable minority is having their rights overridden by the use of the notwithstanding clause. I think all those things may be true, but I also think we've seen enough examples of the public pushing back against uses of the notwithstanding clause to be heartened somewhat. Can't be overly optimistic here, but I think constitutional rights always remain, I think, complex features of a constitutional democracy, and engaging the public in debates, sometimes very hard and challenging debates about where those rights and limits fall, and when they can be overridden, can be a productive democratic process, even though it's often quite fraught, and especially for the community that's having their rights overridden, it can be cold comfort to say, oh, well, terrific, I've had my rights overridden, and now in 4 years there's going to be an election about that. In the meantime, I don't have the rights that the Charter guarantees me. So, those are complex and challenging moments, but we can't avoid complex and challenging moments in a constitutional democracy. They're always there, whether or not you give judges, courts, or legislatures all of the power or some of the power in your constitutional system.
What are some of the other big issues that aren't clearly addressed by Section 33's text?
Let me just recap what it tells us. It clearly tells us how you use the notwithstanding clause. So the language of the Section 33 is that a parliament or legislature has to expressly declare in an act. So that tells us something important. First of all, it tells us that there's only some bodies that can use the notwithstanding clause. It's already limiting who can use it. It's just parliament or legislatures. So it's not the cabinet or the premier or the prime minister. They don't get to invoke or use the notwithstanding clause. It's got to be the elected democratic representative body. It's not cities or towns or university boards of governors. It's limited to parliament or legislatures. And again, they can't announce it in a press conference. They've got to put it into their act. It's got to be part of the lawmaking process. And those choices were, again, very deliberate because they wanted the framers of Section 33 to expose any potential uses of Section 33 to the full rigors of the democratic process. By putting Section 33 necessarily into the law, it means in Parliament, you've got to go through 3 readings. You've got to be debated. It's got to be exposed to public scrutiny and media oversight, and it's got to be a process. And during that time, opponents of the use of Section 33 will be hopefully able to air their views, and the public will be able to observe the democratic making process and have their say about whether or not they think this is a good idea or not. The section also tells us what sections of the Charter can be used in relation to the notwithstanding clause. What sections can be temporarily overridden or what laws, in what ways can the laws protect, from what sections of the Charter can statutes be protected from? And again, it's not the whole Charter. It's sections 2 and section 7 to 15. So what things are not there? That's important. Well, democratic rights, the fact that we get to vote, the fact that there has to be an election every 5 years. So no one can use the notwithstanding clause to turn Canada into a dictatorship by saying we don't need elections anymore. People don't get to vote anymore. Those are off the table. Minority language rights are not subject to Section 33. And people may be wondering about Aboriginal and treaty rights in Section 35. Those fall outside of the Charter, and those are not able to be used in relation to the notwithstanding clause. So what is available? Freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly. Those all fall under Section 2. Life, liberty, and security of the person rights under Section 7. Equality rights under Section 15, and a number of the legal rights of criminally accused. All of those are important, foundational, critical rights and freedoms, and they can be subject to the notwithstanding clause. So they're clearly important. But again, the section also tells us that any use of the notwithstanding clause is limited by up to a 5-year time span that can be renewed. So what is not there in the language of the notwithstanding clause is if there are any preconditions. Some people said and have said, well, for the notwithstanding clause to work well, governments should have to wait for a judicial decision. Well, there's nothing about that in the text of the notwithstanding clause, that issue of preemptive use. So in my view, you can't read in, even if you would prefer that had been there, you can't read that in. It's not there. So I think that it's clear, for me anyway, that Section 33 can be used after judicial decisions, before judicial decisions, in the midst of a long appeal process. That's all on the table as it's currently written. The other thing that's not there is this argument, it's come up in Saskatchewan, well, can a court even hear a case? Can a court issue a constitutional declaration that yes, this statute would have breached the charter. We would have struck this law down, but we are not going to, and we can't, because the government used the notwithstanding clause. There are scholars and lawyers and provincial governments who say once you use the notwithstanding clause, there is now literally nothing for a court to do. There's nothing to argue about. There is no power to issue any of those kinds of remedies. Effectively, the charter rights, some have argued, are effectively disappeared. They're just gone. So if they don't exist, then the court has nothing to do or say. I don't think that's what Section 33 says. It literally, of course, does not say that. That is an interpretation. That's I think, reading in a certain number of features into the notwithstanding clause that I don't see there. So it's clear that, yes, a court, on the language of Section 33, a court cannot strike any laws down that Section 33 is effectively protecting. That's what the language means. The law shall operate. Those are clear words. That law is going to operate, notwithstanding any charter infringement. But I think it doesn't say anything about whether or not there remains a judicial rule in keeping with the other features of our constitutional democracy that would say, yes, courts should be telling the public, they should be able to hear cases from affected parties about the ways in which charter rights are being impacted when governments potentially infringe rights. And that's the question that we're waiting for.
Can you tell us a bit about how Section 33 ended up in the charter? And in particular, can you tell us about why certain premiers, especially those of Alberta and Saskatchewan, wanted to add Section 33?
I'm going to take you back to the exciting days of the late 1970s. I'm a delightful, beautiful baby, but that's not the important point. The important point is that the premiers, Prime Minister Trudeau and the federal government, are engaged really heavily from about 1978 on, and especially from 1980 on, in really tense, challenging debates about whether or not Canada should amend its constitution and bring in a Charter of Rights. And if so, what kind of charter should we have and what rights should be in it? All of those questions are up for grabs. And in those tense debates, a number of premiers, the vast majority of them, the Gang of Eight, they were called because it was 8 premiers across Canada, say, we just don't think this is a good idea. We're not in favor of entrenching a constitutional Bill of Rights, at least in this form. We don't think it's a good idea to hand power over to courts to strike down laws that provinces may pass. If you want to do this for the federal parliament, go ahead. But the constitutional project was really to sweep in both provinces and parliament, all lawmaking in Canada, and subject it to charter guarantees. And a number of premiers said, well, why would we want to limit our own governments? We like a system where we get to make or unmake any law that we want. So there was these fundamental disputes at a really foundational level about whether a charter was a good idea and if Canada should have one. And into this world comes the notwithstanding clause. And it's Premier Peter Lougheed of Alberta, who is being nudged in the ribs by his Minister of Justice, Merv Leach, who's saying, I think the notwithstanding clause may be a way to provide some of this compromise, bridge some of these divides. Well, why did Merv Leach and Peter Lougheed think or know about the notwithstanding clause? Well, because it actually was already in some Canadian rights instruments. The Canadian Bill of Rights in 1960 was a statute of the Parliament which said, in kind of similar language to the Charter, we should protect equality, we should protect freedom of religion and freedom of speech. But because it was simply a statute, there was always the question of, well, what happens if just another statute comes along and infringes freedom of expression? One statute is not allowed to be in charge of a subsequent law. That's just one of the principles of Canadian constitutional law and parliamentary supremacy. So into the Canadian Bill of Rights, the Conservative government of the day said, well, let's put in a notwithstanding clause so that if a subsequent law wants to go over and override the Canadian Bill of Rights, they're going to have to do so really explicitly. They're going to have to say that that's what they're doing. And when they have to say that that's what they're doing, in fact, that will be a disincentive for them to do that. And so the notwithstanding clause was added as a kind of an effort to make any rights infringements even more transparent, but also to provide that political cost that would in fact prevent subsequent future governments from interfering with or ignoring the Canadian Bill of Rights. Back to Merv Leach. He says to Peter Lougheed, well, we've got a notwithstanding clause in the Canadian Bill of Rights. We just added one to the Alberta Bill of Rights. Can't this work some magic in the constitutional context? Can't the provinces get some retention of their political parliamentary supremacy? And maybe the federal government will get their desired charter, and everybody wins by this compromise. Trudeau didn't really like this idea, wasn't in favor. Pierre Trudeau, the prime minister, had to be convinced. And he gets convinced at really the 11th hour. In 1981, we're down to the wire. The negotiation sessions are ending. And it's here that a number of premiers, Peter Lougheed among them, but also, Ontario, Saskatchewan, everybody's kind of throwing in their 2 cents. And one of the key pieces of compromise is the notwithstanding clause. Although Trudeau insists, can't be on everything. It's got to be only on certain rights. So it's a compromise within a compromise. And very famously, Quebec is left out of these last-minute negotiations. This all comes as a surprise and a disappointment to Quebec, who doesn't like the deal. But for the rest of the premiers of Canada, and certainly Peter Lougheed and Alan Blakeney in Saskatchewan, the notwithstanding clause is a good enough compromise. They're willing to now sign on to the charter, and that's what they do.
Some feel that the notwithstanding clause is irredeemable and should be abolished. What are our options for getting rid of the clause, and how difficult would this be to accomplish?
The notwithstanding clause entered life controversially in those last-minute negotiations. Although, it was also an old idea in the discussions themselves, but it did catch some people off guard, and some people hated it right away. This was a compromised charter. As some people said, this is a compromise that compromises the charter. And we've, just had this important moment of guaranteeing rights and then immediately effectively take them away or render them less secure. For some of the critics, the fact that Quebec right out of the gates uses the notwithstanding clause, not against one law, but against every one of their laws as a political objection to the charter. So within weeks of the charter coming into, maybe a couple of months, maybe it's June of 1982, Quebec invokes the notwithstanding clause over every existing Quebec law, and saying, well, you put it in the charter. We don't like the charter. You put this clause in here. We're going to use it. And they did. And so a number of critics emerge, among them Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who hated it. He said it made the charter not worth the paper it was printed on. He was not a fan of the notwithstanding clause. And there have been those who have maintained that view in the 30 years, 40 years since. So for its harshest critics, I think it is an irredeemable flaw at the heart of the charter. And for those individuals, I'm not sure I count myself among them, but for those individuals, it's only a constitutional amendment, I think, that would satisfy them, they would want the power removed. The prospect of a constitutional amendment to the notwithstanding clause under the general amending formula is almost zero. Whatever number is closest to zero that you can imagine, which isn't zero, it's just not going to happen because you need that provincial consent. And in particular, you're going to need Quebec on board and the West. And too many provinces are too attached to the potential uses of the notwithstanding clause to, I think, even make this a live possibility. So what's the other option? Well, learning to live with the notwithstanding clause is, I think, the only thing that's the only road in front of us. Some people have speculated, and there may be some appetite for this, could you have governments that limit their own powers under regular laws, maybe disavow the notwithstanding clause in legislation? Or say things like, well, the Parliament will never use the notwithstanding clause unless, it's a unanimous vote in the House of Commons or something, or at least 2/3 of the members agree. Or you could imagine a law that said it won't be used unless there's a Supreme Court of Canada decision. So, to try and deal with that preemptive use issue, or unless the opposition party, the official opposition agrees, or something like that, to really put the notwithstanding clause back into the place that some have always wanted it to be, which is as a pure emergency measure. Court's gone crazy. We've got to have some response. You could potentially, through legislation, elevate the stakes. Now, what's the downside of doing that? Well, the biggest, I don't know if it's a downside, but it's a limit, is that those would just be regular laws, and they could be changed by any future government. So any government that actually wanted to use the notwithstanding clause, if there was a law that said, well, you can't unless it's unanimous, they could simply write a law that said, well, not in this instance. We're going to use it anyway. And so if you really want the sticky stuff of tying government's hands, you've got to put it in the supreme law of Canada, which is the Constitution. Anything else is a bit of window dressing. It can be symbolic. It can be powerful. It can add to the kind of political stakes, but it can't actually tie the hands of a future government that wants to use it.
Is there anything courts can do to place limits on its use, such as accepting workaround arguments around claims that come to them?
This, I think, is the moment that's still unfolding. So the first case that tried to tackle this in the 1980s was around Quebec's use in a number of cases, and there were arguments that said, can't be used preemptively, can't be used in an omnibus fashion as Quebec did, can't be used to kind of blanket every law, has to be a government needs to have more explanation about why it's using it. And on and on and on. So you could imagine a number of preconditions being attached. There has to be, for example, some would say, a justifiable Section 1 argument that the government has put forward. Unless the government can put forward a reasonable Section 1 argument, even if the court wouldn't agree with it, then it shouldn't be able to use the notwithstanding clause. The problem with all of those preconditions, those potential judicial examinations of the reasons for using the notwithstanding clause, is one, that's not in the text of the clause. So there need to be some creative interpretation, I think, of the words that are there. And second, I think a court has to be mindful of the purposes of the notwithstanding clause. And the purposes of the notwithstanding clause, I think it's fair to say, based on the historical record and the views of many of the framers, are to preserve some elements of parliamentary supremacy. Not complete, not unfettered, not total. That would be my view. I don't think it disappears those rights out of existence. But to begin to turn around and say, well, yes, the notwithstanding clause is there, but now courts have the power to say, but we don't like the way you're using the notwithstanding clause. For me, anyway, actually goes against the purpose of the provision itself. And I don't think that that's ultimately where courts will land. It certainly wasn't where the Supreme Court of Canada was at in 1988 when it looked at this case in Ford. It really threw up its hands and said, whoa, we're not going to get into judging government's use of the notwithstanding clause. They get to make those decisions. Those decisions are subject to political debate and political accountability, but there's no standard by which a court could effectively, I think, say, well, this is a good use and this is a bad use of the notwithstanding clause. They may all be bad. They all may be good. It's going to depend on your constitutional perspective. And I think the courts will want to stay out of that game. But the question is, do they stay out of the game entirely, or do they say, well, we're not going to judge? This would be my preferred outcome, and it's one I think that the best preserves the text and the purpose of the notwithstanding clause is for a court to say, we're not going to limit the ability of governments to use the notwithstanding clause. That's just not in the text or the purpose of the provision. But we have a role to play in articulating when those laws interfere with rights. That's got to be part of the public conversation. The governments should know when they are interfering with rights. The public should know when rights are being interfered with. An individual who's had their freedom of religion taken away should have the court be prepared to recognize that. That's what it means to live under a constitution that is supreme and that guarantees rights. I think there is that for me, small, maybe modest in some ways, but still meaningful judicial role, even when the notwithstanding clause is used. Whether courts will come to that view is the question that the Supreme Court of Canada is going to tackle, I think, in these upcoming cases.
So we know the notwithstanding clause was created as a part of the Charter in 1982, and it was first used that same year in Quebec. Can you give us an overview of this first invocation and the Supreme Court's subsequent review of it in the 1988 Ford decision?
Absolutely. So remember what's sometimes called the Night of the Long Knives. That's the time when Quebec was not part of the final compromise negotiations, which led to the enactment of the Charter, and every premier agreeing to the Charter alongside the federal government, but for Quebec. So Quebec's left out of this final deal. And Quebec is upset about that. And Quebec looks for a number of ways to try and do something about that. They have at least two constitutional strategies. One is to challenge the constitutionality of the new charter in a case that goes to the Supreme Court of Canada. Quebec says, well, we should have a veto over constitutional amendments. The court says, no, you don't. And the charter is the law of the land. That was strategy number one. Strategy number two was, well, let's read this thing. And some enterprising government of Quebec lawyer got to Section 33 and said, well, okay, we don't like this thing. There's a provision in here that lets us get out of lots of it. And so that's exactly what Quebec did. They said, well, we're going to use the notwithstanding clause, not selectively, not deliberately, but in a blanket omnibus fashion over everything. We're going to attach it to every Quebec law that exists and every Quebec law that we enact. And that was a shocking use for many. Again, it in some ways confirmed what some of the critics of the notwithstanding clause had worried about. Well, if you put this power in the charter, what's to stop a government from using it, even in ways that you didn't anticipate. And I think one of the Quebec ministers at the time said, look, it's not a decoration. What did you think we were going to do? It's there to be used. We used it. Then that immediately triggers both kind of a political reaction, especially in English Canada. Well, this is bad, is what some thought. Of course, it's more complex in Quebec because the political objection to the charter was very keenly felt throughout the community, and Quebec at that time also maintained rights under its Quebec provincial human rights legislation. So Quebec said, it's not like we're getting rid of freedom of religion. We're just getting rid of freedom of religion under the charter. So it was really quite a profound and powerful political statement. But it was also bound to engage constitutional litigation, which it did. That ends up at the Supreme Court of Canada in 1988 in the Ford decision, Ford in Quebec, in which the Supreme Court is wrestling with, can Quebec use the notwithstanding clause in this fashion? I was going to say cavalier fashion, but maybe that's too much editorializing. Can you put it in this blanket way over everything? And the court said, yes, they could, because the judicial role under the terms of Section 33 was not to question, or there was no capacity to judicially review the reasons for using the notwithstanding clause. And as long as you complied with the elements of the provision, well, did Quebec expressly declare that the notwithstanding clause was being invoked in an act? Yes, it did. And that particular statute had the power to attach it to every other law. Well, that's a power that the court said Quebec lawmakers possess, and I think they're right about that. Did they have to say more and explain the ways in which rights were being overridden? The court said no. The language of Section 33 is really quite plain. You just have to indicate the sections of the charter that you're overriding, and Quebec did that. Section 2 and Section 7 to 15 of the charter. There was one part, though, that the court said Quebec could not do. And that was because Quebec had enacted this law, I think in June, there was a bit of a gap between the coming into force of the charter in April of 1982, April 17th, and when this law came into effect in June. And so Quebec said the use of the notwithstanding clause, or the invocation, is going to be effectively backdated. We're going to make it retroactive to to April 17th of 1982. We're going to close the gap. And governments have the power to make legislation retroactive as long as they're explicit. But the court had to answer the question, well, but could a legislature make the notwithstanding clause retroactive? And there they read the language of Section 33, and they said, we don't see in the language of Section 33 the power to make it retroactive. You can't go back in time. And at least part of that interpretation, because it's not entirely clear, Section 33 could be read as allowing for retroactive use or not. It's not explicit. At least some of that reading of Section 33 as being prospective only was because the court recognized that Section 33 has the power to take away rights. And it should be read narrowly. It should be read restrictively because of its power to restrict those rights. And so there's some recognition, I think, in that case, in that Ford case, even though for the most part, the court says, of course, governments can use this clause. It's in the Constitution. They can use it. But they did also recognize there's a bit of tension here with this clause and the other elements of our constitutional system. And because of those tensions, it should be read narrowly to avoid retroactive effect.
Can you tell us about the trends in the frequency and geographic distribution of the notwithstanding clause invocations since 4?
So out of the gates, we have Quebec obviously embracing the use of the notwithstanding clause, and they've used it sporadically since then. Quebec did let the sun set on the blanket invocation, and it's used it selectively ever since. But Quebec has used it in a number of pieces of legislation in the last 5 years or so, most controversially in what's called Bill 21, the law that you'll speak about on future podcasts. But Quebec is not alone, and they weren't alone out of the gates either. Saskatchewan used the provision in the 1980s. Alberta used the provision in the 1990s, but Ontario has used the clause most recently in a number of pieces of legislation, some of which it then repealed when the public reacted quite negatively to the potential use. But Ontario has held the invocation of the notwithstanding clause in a campaign finance limiting law that's also being litigated on constitutional grounds. The dynamic that's also starting to unfold with Ontario's recent uses, Saskatchewan's recent uses, and a number of provinces, Alberta and New Brunswick, saying they would be willing to use it and may use it. And of course, the official leader of the opposition has said that he effectively will use it if he forms the next government of Canada, which would be the first time Parliament has used it. It does feel like we're in a new moment of the notwithstanding clause's political history. The doors have cracked open a little further in normalizing its use. It's not still fully, I think it's wrong to say that it's being regularly and frequently used. It isn't. It's still only those provinces, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, that have used it. But I think it's fair to say that the recent uses and the musing about future uses from other jurisdictions have suggested that the notwithstanding clause is not being contained within that kind of emergency cabinet box that some people, smash this glass and take out the notwithstanding clause if there's a fire. That's what some people hoped would be the future of the notwithstanding clause. And we're in a moment right now where the uses that are being contemplated are not simply emergency uses, but a more regular feature of some kinds of government lawmaking.
So it seems like a lot has changed since the Ford decision, including Canada's political climate. For example, many scholars and commentators suggest that Canadian politics has been influenced by the global rise of populism over the years. Do you think this is true? And do you think this has played a role in how often governments have been resorting to the notwithstanding clause?
That's a good question, and it's one I think that's going to be under the microscope for legal scholars and political scientists and the media. It's hard to comment on the moment that's unfolding. And I think this moment is unfolding. So it maybe is going to be to future scholars to really unpack the dynamics. And populism would seem to be one of those dynamics that Canada is participating in at a political level. It's a global phenomenon in the West, and it's that label is used pejoratively by some. For others, it's going to be a political movement that offers a great deal of excitement and energy and a rebalancing of political priorities that's appropriate. So, that's the stuff of politics. We govern ourselves in messy ways, and we're in a moment where there are some underlying shifting plates in our political culture. That doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's how we govern ourselves. Is some of that playing into a increased willingness to use the notwithstanding clause? That may be right. It strikes me, though, that one of the things that has happened over the long, I don't know how long, if 40 years is, but in the history of the Charter, again, this idea that the notwithstanding clause was going to effectively limit itself because of the high political costs. Governments just wouldn't want to incur them. But then, because of the particular political dynamics in Quebec, and especially where governments have this political objection to the Charter, and communitarian political values have always weighed a little more strongly in Quebec political culture because of its unique political history and place in North America. The Legault government said using the notwithstanding clause may be popular. If we've got legislation that we think is popular, but that a court is going to disagree with, and Bill 21, I say a court disagree with, a court's going to find that it interferes with some charter rights, which I think was inevitable. Then the notwithstanding clause was just there. Go back to that comment from the Quebec minister. It's not a decoration. It's there, and if we can use it to make this political or this popular political policy operative, if we can avoid a fight with the courts about it, why wouldn't we use that? And having used it, and the earth didn't cave in on the Legault government, I think the polling generally shows that they at the moment they're unpopular for other reasons, but I'm not sure it's the notwithstanding clause that has been the problem. So other provincial governments took a look at that and said, maybe the political costs calculation can bend in our favor. And then what happens, I think, is, at first everyone's might be worried that, the stove is too hot to touch. And so everyone's got their hands kind of in the air. Don't touch that hot stove. But the first time a person, kind of gently puts the hand down on the element, says, actually, it's not that hot. You can touch that thing. It's a little warm, but it's you're not going to get burned. Then all of a sudden, a bunch of other hands start, pressing on that element, saying, "Oh yeah, okay, you're right. Yeah, that's not that hot." That may also be happening with the notwithstanding clause. Quebec put their hand on the stove and said, maybe it's not that hot, and Ontario followed along and they put their hand on it, and maybe Alberta and New Brunswick are going to follow along. So I think that's the moment that we're in. The notwithstanding clause may get more use in the months and years ahead. I think that's more likely than not. But as soon as that happens, it's also going to create the opportunities for the jurisprudence of the notwithstanding clause to also develop. There's going to be cases about it. We're seeing them already. We're seeing them now. And courts are going to have to wrestle with a world in which governments are using the notwithstanding clause. What does that mean for how that clause gets interpreted? I think that will play a role.
I have a final two-part question about the types of governments that tend to invoke the notwithstanding clause. It's primarily been used by conservative governments to protect their policies. Why do you think progressives have been less interested in using the clause, even though there's been an abundance of left-wing critiques of the Charter? And are there specific situations where you think the notwithstanding clause might be more attractive to progressives?
I think in answering this question, you have to start with Alan Blakeney, the premier of Saskatchewan, the NDP premier, in those 1981 negotiations. And Alan Blakeney was a committed social democrat out of the strong, long Saskatchewan prairie tradition of social democratic governance. And Alan Blakeney was no fan of courts, who, like people of his generation and political persuasion, had been largely conservative forces protecting. I mean, coming out of the American tradition as well. When you talked about the U.S. Supreme Court protecting rights, it was often the rights to property or the rights to contract, and very famously in a case called Lochner in 1905, striking down minimum wage laws, or various kinds of worker protection, saying, well, no, everyone has the right to work for, however many cents an hour they wish. The state can't intervene and interfere in people's contracts in that way. So that idea lingered in Canada for a long time in the left. And Alan Blakeney says, well, why would I want to hand all this power over to courts? What if they say you can't have income tax? What if they say you can't limit, you can't protect the environment because that limits the rights of corporations to do whatever they want? You can't have public health care because people should have the right to buy health care. Alan Blakeney was very worried that the history of judicial power in this country had largely been deployed he would say, to protect corporate interests. He wasn't alone in that view. And he said, you need the Notwithstanding Clause to allow a social democratic response to courts that are protecting corporations and corporate rights in advance of the public good. And he was a strong supporter of the Notwithstanding Clause on that basis. Is that really what happened? Well, certainly the left-wing critique continued. There was a number of cases through the 1980s in which you see corporations using the Notwithstanding Clause to protect expressive freedoms, or, famously Big M Drug Mart, which didn't have a religious conviction. It was a corporation saying, well, freedom of religion means we get to be open on Sunday. And so the critique kind of remained, the charter's being used to roll back, protections on workers. But that wasn't really the story of the 1990s and 2000s. Progressives have had lots of critiques that the charter hasn't gone far enough, but the progressive critique has not tended to be that the charter is being used to protect certain kinds of laws which are, harming the public good. That hasn't really been the story of the last 25 years. And so there haven't been very good instances, although maybe we've come close in a couple, where someone would say, well, there's the left wing, there's the progressive opportunity to champion the Notwithstanding Clause. Maybe the closest we've come is in the healthcare litigation, in the Shauli case, and some others like it, in which courts have wondered whether or not some of Canada's public healthcare system at the provincial level interferes with people's rights of security of the person by preventing people from timely access to some healthcare because people can't purchase private health insurance, and there's not a robust private health model in some areas of care. If the Supreme Court of Canada ever said, Canada can't have, the Canada Health Act and socialized, Medicare, and took a big cut into public health care in Canada, well, then I think you would see some arguments that champion the use of the Notwithstanding Clause from a progressive perspective. That might be true in environmental legislation if rights and freedoms ever get used to strike down limits that are imposed for environmental rationales. But until we see that, and we haven't really, then I think it's mostly going to be conservative governments that have found that the Charter places the most interference in the way of their policy objectives. And whenever that's the case, it opens up the prospect, the enticing prospect of the notwithstanding clause.
Well, this brings me to the end of my questions. Thank you so much for your time and expertise, Professor Adams.
Oh, thanks so much for the great questions and for the chance to talk about this really important issue.
That brings us to the end of the first episode of Cause for Concern, Notwithstanding Canada's Charter. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Eric Adams and learned something cool to share at your next politically charged family dinner. Join us for the next episode, where we explore how the clause has been invoked by the Government of Ontario, a province that has only recently begun using it after nearly 40 years of disinterest. Thanks for listening.